Awesome. Thanks, William. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the VEBA Community Call. We haven't met in December because it was during the PTO holidays. So there's a bunch of news and things that have happened since the last meeting in November, which we're going to go through today. But first of all, I think we have maybe one or two new members in this call today. At least Jeff, I guess, and yeah, maybe Jeff. So anyone who's new or who wants to just quickly speak up and talk a little bit about how much you know about VEBA, the motivation, whether you're already using VEBA or not, that's much appreciated before we dive into the section. And also any questions you have that we should address before the agenda as well.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I work for a moderate-sized marketing company, have a fairly good-sized environment. We've been playing with VEBA on and off in the lab for quite a while. I've not run anything into production, but am anxious to get some stuff going to help with some self-healing processes across our environments.
That's a typical use case. Thanks, Jeff. Did I forget anyone? I don't think so.
I think I'm relatively new. You guys know me. But
Aubrey. Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so I work for a big cybersecurity company, and we're evaluating VEBA to run automations on our lab when they turn on and stuff like that, gather information. We have two relatively big vCenter servers. One is about 5,000 VMs and the other one is about 15, I think, something like that. But yeah.
Nice. And the use cases, Avery, that you have, like Jeff mentioned, kind of self-healing reconciliation.
Yeah, so we want to collect information or do certain things when our engineers turn on their labs. So every lab is a collection of VMs, and we need to gather information, and we also need to do certain automations when an engineer reverts the lab to a known good configuration. So yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Great. So let's. Any topics that someone wants to add to the list of the agenda? I'm happy to add things. If feel free to drop them in the chat if you don't want to speak up, and I'll just add them to the.
Yeah, any burning questions, things that you've not been able to figure out, we certainly would like to bring those generally up early before we jump into our kind of planned agenda. So if you have something, feel free to shout it out or mention in chat, like mentioned by Michael, or even interrupt during the thing if something does come up as well.
Yes, I'll just wait a minute here, then watch the chat.
Are there any plans to improve the what is it called, the sockeye interface? Because I've been playing around with it, and it's very clunky, to say the least. Like if for example, I know some events happen and I see them in the log, in the Kubernetes log, in the container, but like sockeye doesn't filter, doesn't show them or stuff like that.
So the person who created sockeye, he's now with a startup, which is also working in the security space. And so I still see him being active in the creative space from time to time, but I've not seen him making any major changes to sockeye. Having said that, we know him. And so Scott actually here, and he was always happy to improve things. I don't know how much time he can still spend on it. But if there are issues that you have, so one issue, for example, in sockeye is, and that might not be resolvable, is if you refresh sockeye, the so for anyone not knowing sockeye, it's this like /events endpoint in VEBA where you see these the JSON events coming through VEBA in a UI. So if you refresh that page, it basically starts from now again. So sockeye is stateless, and so some people think, yeah, I just need like I set a filter and then I reload, and basically all the stuff happening before that is gone. And so even filtering then obviously won't show anything because that's gone. Now, sometimes filters, the syntax is a little bit weird. Like I think it's case sensitive as well. And it just does like prefix suffix matching and not like inward matching. I think that's also something to be aware of. But again, I think those are things, at least the filter stuff, are things that can be fixed. So if you want to raise an issue, and maybe Scott spent some time, but it's again, it's something not in the VEBA like that came from the Knative community.
And that's the only project that does something like that. There's no alternative to sockeye, or like something that's actively developed, or.
So I mean, obviously, we're looking into productizing more aspects of VEBA as we go, like having better introspection and so on. Right now, I can't comment on any internal product developments there.
Okay.
But certainly the user experience, and if you also saw the UI prototype that we did, where you can manage your events and functions from vCenter UI with the plugin, right? Those were prototypes that we built to research how users would like interface with a non-terminal or CLI-based interface. And so the UI improvements and experience is definitely like top priority for us. But right now, they're like, at least from the VEBA side, they're not active work to add a UI capability natively to VEBA in the Fling. Yeah, but be aware like that it's been tracked and noted that we have to definitely simplify the whole experience. So.
Okay.
Fair point, Avery. I'll take a note in the
also, one other thing that I was asking you is about. So obviously the vCenter plugin probably talks to an API of some sort to create functions or stuff like that. Is this API? Is it possible to use this API to create functions without vCenter? So, for example, like if I wanna automate creating functions or with like REST API or something like that.
Yeah, the plugin is kind of built in two components, right? Part of it is talking to vSphere and basically using our UI plugin SDK to manifest the different widgets that you see there. So if you're not interested in using the vSphere UI, today you can already deploy functions through either Knative or Kubernetes, right? And so from an API point of view, the plugin is actually talking to the Kubernetes API, which is run within VEBA. So yes, the answer is yes. You can certainly use the Kubernetes API and talk to the Knative endpoints to construct your functions and deploy them and go through the full lifecycle management without using a UI or a CLI tooling.
And is that document? Is there an example somewhere on how to use something like that? How to use it?
We don't have anything specifically documented because this is more of like a Knative and Kubernetes aspect of it.
I see.
Michael may have some resources that we can maybe point you to if you're interested in kind of exploring the Kubernetes REST API.
Okay, cool. No, thanks.
Yeah, I can. We can have a separate session, Avery, if you want to.
Yeah.
How to might this, and I think there's even like Terraform plugins for Kubernetes, and stuff like that, or Chef. So at the end of the day, a function is nothing but a Kubernetes object resource in the API, right? And so you don't need even need specific Knative knowledge for what you're asking for, which is good.
Okay,
cool. So, okay, no further questions in the chat. Again, as William said, just keep questions coming, interrupt as where needed. So in terms of the first agenda item, this is an update on the upcoming V08 release. So remember, we did the 07.2 release, I think in December. So next topic. V08 updates. Back to that item. So let me start with one thing, and then I hand it over to William because he was actively working on a couple of them. So one update or like important update in 08 is the broker enhancements that we have, which is we currently have the issue in the internal RabbitMQ broker that we use in VEBA that we don't like parallel or like paralyze the processing of events. And that means that quickly, depending on the burst of events going through VEBA, it could lead to a backlog in event processing, but obviously only for those events where there's a trigger and where a function is subscribed to it. Now with the 08 update, what we have is we allow a setting in the function or in the trigger, to be more specific, when you deploy the function and the trigger, to say, I want to like paralyze the processing. So a function would then get more than just one event at the same time. And it depends on your function code and logic, whether that's going to break. Like if you're doing state manipulation or other stuff, you might have to be careful. But if you're just sending stuff, for example, to Slack or CMDB or so, then you can easily paralyze this and your function would just be invoked multiple times, the handler with like those different events and in parallel or concurrently. And so we believe that this is like one fix to address the scalability concerns. The other one is at least one semantics. And what that means is that we do want to guarantee that if an event is received from vCenter, that we deliver it at least once to a function if it's subscribed to. And right now with 07, due to like the different components involved in there, the challenge is that we don't guarantee this. So so the at least once, and again, so we are right now in the at most once space, meaning we actually don't guarantee that an event, in case of a broker crash or whatever, will make it to a function. And with 08, we have done some significant improvements there in the Rabbit side to like try and guarantee that once we accept an event or get an event from vCenter or any of the other sources that we have, and we write it to the broker, to the RabbitMQ broker, to the queue, then we'll try at least, I think, 3 times, like three tries to deliver it to a function, and then we'll give up. Now, there's more settings that you can do manually, like if you deploy the router into like a Kubernetes or Knative environment, so you can define dead letter queues if an event cannot be processed by a function to like put it in another queue and then introspect it afterwards. But those are things that we're not setting by default in VEBA, and they also require some changes in Knative currently to like also guarantee at least once. But we believe that these 2 features, like the parallel processing, at least one semantics, are good improvements in terms of like more hardening and productionizing the messaging fabric in VEBA. Any questions on this one?
Yeah, I have a question. So is there a way to limit the amount of, let's say, how many functions can run? Or the reason I'm asking is like, what happens if there are too many events and the appliance doesn't have enough like memory to handle that? Or
so there's 2 answers to this. One is right now, and even with 08, what's not going to happen is that, let's say you're subscribing a function to a VM powered on event, and you get like hundreds of these events in a burst. What with the RabbitMQ broker implementation that we use in VEBA, what's not going to happen is that we will spin up 100 functions. It will remain one function. And if you have scale to 0, basically, like if there's no function currently running, it will spin one instance up. And then depending on your concurrency or parallelism setting with the new feature in 08, you can say this function then will be able to process like 10 or 20 of these events concurrently. And so that's kind of a first guardrail, if you want, where we do allow for some parallelism within a function instance, but we don't scale up the function instance to multiple pods or containers, so to say. The second part.
So so I understand. So let's say I limit it to, you said, like, let's say 10, right? And I have 10 VMs turning on, and it's supposed to run the function, or let's say I have 11 VMs powering on. It has to run the same function at the same time. So it will run 10 in parallel, then when the 10 will finish to run like the last one?
No, what's going to happen technically is that it will, let's say you have one function instance running, and what's happening is that you get these 11 powered on events. And if in the trigger you add this new setting and say, my function can do like 10 events per like concurrently, right? At the same time, what's going to happen is that the Rabbit broker will send 10 events to the same function instance, to the same container, to that one thing that is running.
So
We're
I have to
spin up 10 functions.
So I have to write the function to be able to handle. Like I'm not sure I understand. Concurrent. So yeah.
Yes. Well, what you have to be aware of that you don't need to write your function in a way that it's, you don't have to change anything in the code to make it concurrent runnable, because all the templates that we use and provide, like the Go, the Python, the PowerShell, they already spin up an HTTP server, and that HTTP server is able to process it's just serving HTTP, right? So it's going to already allow for concurrency. But right now, what we have in VEBA is that we only send one event to that HTTP server in a function. We wait for the function to finish, like basically for an HTTP response, 200. And then we pick up the next one. And this gives you first in, first out semantics, which is good because we keep order at that point, right? Once you introduce this parallelism by saying, oh, my function, this basically HTTP server, right, that I'm using, can do 10 events at the same, like concurrently, we will take 10 events from the queue if they are there and send it to the function, like basically 10 HTTP calls at the same time to your function. Because your handler, the code that you write in this handler logic, right, that is still invoked just with one event, but then 10 times concurrently. You need to only make or be aware of that if you are like setting a counter in a database, for example, or you have a memory counter or whatever, that this is thread safe. So it can be basically manipulated by multiple routines, threads, whatever the language does under the covers, right? If you're just sending
so like if you have like a global variable, like it will affect all of them or something like that. Okay,
yes.
I
you need to
it.
protect it. Yes.
Yeah. And is there a plan to eventually also allow for multiple
functions?
multiple containers of the same function?
Yes. So technically, you could work around this limitation already, which is like a manual install and an add-on of a plugin. For the RabbitMQ side, I work closely with the team. I have not seen any active issue that's being worked on to make this work, because it requires fundamental changes also to the way Rabbit is implemented in Knative. But
the reason I'm asking is because this functionality is like very important to what I'm trying to do. So I'll give it a spin and I'll see how well it works. But
so
this is like this thing is a major thing we need in order to use VEBA for our use case.
Yes, so the alternative there is, what you can always do is, when you deploy a function, you give the function a name, right? You call it send to Slack. And you also give it a trigger, send to Slack, and the trigger is VM powered on event. What you can do is you can create 10 different functions, send to Slack 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 10. Under the covers, that will then create 10 deployments, with one container each. And if you don't bump up the concurrency settings, you have your parallelism. It's a little bit cheating because it's manual hard-coded scaling instead of auto scaling.
But how would it know? So how would it know which power on event? How would it know that? Let's say I have a power on event. How would it know to which one of the functions to send it to?
That's right. There's no.
Is it going to send it to all of them, or?
Yeah, it's going to send to all of them unless you write some filter logic there, like per cluster, per folder.
Right. So I'll use this the way it is, and I'll see if it works for me, and if not, I'll give feedback.
Yes, please do. That's always appreciated. Perfect. So that's all I had for 08. I want to pass it. Any questions on the at least once semantics? Was that clear, the message delivery stuff, or questions there? Cool. With that, I'm going to pass it to William just briefly to cover the other 08 updates that we have in the agenda. Can you see the agenda well, William?
Yep, I can see it.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm just gonna look at GitHub really quickly, just to outline some things. So there's a number of changes. These were worked on roughly around last year after we did our 071 release, which is the current latest release. If you go to the Fling website, if you wanted to download the appliance, and then obviously we've been committing these changes, and these are going to be more larger changes and basically breaking changes, and so that's why we kind of save this off for our next major release. So a couple of big changes is around deprecation and removal of the processor. In 071, we kind of announced deprecation for a number of the existing processors. Just for everybody's background, the backend implementation of VEBA uses something called Knative. That is our current backend to date. That's where active development is, and certainly ties into things like cloud native runtime, which is sort of our commercial offering of Knative for those that are interested in sort of an official supported offering that gives you a similar VEBA-like capabilities. And so from 08, what we've done is remove support for Event Bridge, OpenFAS, as well as the external Knative processor. Part of this is just simplifying our code base and also making it simple out of the box. And so as an end user, you're not really going to see a big difference. When you deploy, you have less options to choose from. We basically defaulted to Knative, which is the backend that we've been using for a number of releases now. And a lot of the optimizations, examples that you see that we've been sharing with you are all Knative based. So for these reasons, we haven't spent time updating those other processors. If you're a user of the VMware Event Router, which is a component of VEBA, right, you can download the VEBA virtual appliance and use it as is. For other customers who have Kubernetes experience or want to have a more scaled out deployment, you can actually just take the event router and deploy that using just standard Kubernetes or even just a Helm chart. And from a router point of view, we've not removed the event bridge functionality. So if you continue to rely on that functionality, you can certainly continue using that. And at some point in time in the future, we may over time clean up that code base and remove it. But for now, these deprecations that I mentioned are specifically to just the virtual appliance that you download as a Fling. On top of that, we've also spent some time updating the build of material. So basically the software stack includes Kubernetes. And so right now we're at the time of working on this, I think it's 121.5 is the current version of Kubernetes. And so we try to move the versions of the bottom to the latest and greatest, for a number of reasons, performance, bug fixes, and just making sure that we're running the latest versions, because as Kubernetes lifecycle evolves, there are certain components that are going to get deprecated, things like pod security policies. So we want to make sure that we're constantly looking at the overall stack and to make sure that we're using roughly the latest. We're not going to be on bleeding edge. So I think we're roughly around N-1, wherever the Kubernetes releases are, and we continue to reevaluate that. Some of this might be capabilities that we need, feature sets. So that's kind of generally when we look at the versions of the BOM. In addition to the Kubernetes stack getting updated in the upcoming 08 release, we've also done a revamp of the entire VEBA stack. So this includes, latest version of Photon OS as an operating system. Again, bug fixes, performance enhancements. We've also updated we plan to update the Knative serving and eventing stack. So this is basically the backend that gives you these capabilities. I think we were in like a V0 21, 22-ish versioning, and they recently released their 1.x release, which was a huge milestone for the Knative community. And so we're currently planning on using the 1.10 release, which is the latest. It has a number of fixes and enhancements that we actually require as well. So that's another big change for the infrastructure. No real changes from a customer standpoint. So functions that you've written or are currently consuming, they continue to work as is. There's no real change there. So again, this is mostly backend changes. And then one that may see some changes there is that in early versions of Kubernetes, the runtime to basically run these container images had a number of different options. The default or the most popular was basically using Docker. So when you log into VEBA itself and when a container gets scheduled, it's using the Docker runtime. In more recent releases of Kubernetes, Docker as a runtime has been deprecated and will be removed in a future release. And I believe that's planned for the next major Kubernetes release. So that's already been communicated several releases ago. And it is a big change. And so again, this is one of those things we wanted to wait because it does affect, mostly the back end of how things are wired up. It doesn't necessarily affect end users. Now, in some cases, we have seen some behaviors where the Docker runtime might cause issues with filling up the file system. So we've had to bump the space and all that. So there definitely is some benefits there. And so we're going from Docker to Containerd, which is generally the most popular runtime. And I believe it will probably be one of the default runtimes. And we certainly have even VMware's Kubernetes commercial offering. It's used Containerd for quite some time. So certainly Docker as a runtime in the Kubernetes ecosystem is going away, or will be going away shortly. And so that was another significant change from a VEBA point of view. And some of those things includes changes into the actual utilities that you use to, maybe list a repository. And so if you're familiar with like Docker commands, we just need to switch them to Containerd commands. But for day-to-day usage, again, no impact to end users. Those are some of the big items. We had a couple of minor bug fixes, things that you may see, but those are kind of the big changes that we see in the upcoming 08 release. Let me know if there are any questions or comments.
So because you're switching to Containerd, we'll just have to make sure that the container images are OCI compliant, right?
Yeah, well, all container images must be OCI compliant by default. And so whether you build them with Docker or, Knative build packs is kind of the more modern way of building it. So overall, I think the industry is moving away from, depending on Docker and all these different components. And even Docker as an organization company have broken out these components, open source the individual pieces from how you build an OCI image to how you run it, how you scan it. And so these are all very compliant standards. And so from the runtime standpoint in Kubernetes, they've just decided, hey, we're going to move into a more open standard. And so this has been in the plans for quite some time, but it doesn't affect how you're building images today, Avery. And so if you do a Docker build and you push it to Docker, Harbor, or any OCI compliant registry, and you go and say, hey, deploy this function, like a Slack function that's going to react to a powered off event, it will run it. There's no changes there. When you used to deploy Kubernetes, you actually had like 3 choices of picking a runtime, and Docker was just the most popular one because it's the easiest at the time. And now when you start to install modern Kubernetes or latest versions of Kubernetes, it generally defaults to Containerd. So no changes there from a end user point of view.
Thanks.
Great question. That's all for me, Michael.
Thanks, William. So next one, the event history collector bug, which that's what I spent most of my time this week already on. So Avery reached out and reported basically that one of his busy VCs are not returning any events from VEBA. And so he enabled debugging the debug logs in VEBA in the event router. And he could see that the event router was basically saying no new events and backing off. So that's the default behavior if there are no new events in the router received from vCenter. But this was very strange because it's a busy VC. The role, the user account being used to retrieve and log into VC had proper permissions. And at the same time, a PowerShell or PowerCLI VI get VI events command that worked. And also Go VC, if you're familiar with Go VC, that's this Go binary. Okay, thanks, Sydney. Go VC also has an events subcommand where you can receive events. And we actually saw a couple of events. So this was weird. And then we tried Python, PyVMomi, and we tried some other PowerCLI code from Avery. And we found that the Go VC command and the PowerCLI get VI commands, they use a slightly different API or property, if you will, to read some events, versus the API that we are using and that all the other libraries are also using, which is I would say the preferred one because it gives you this stream of events behavior that we want. And we debugged this with Avery and also then with the engineering team. And the issue is caused by a field or attribute in the vCenter database related to the events. Every event has an ID. And that ID is an integer 32 field in the database. And so it can overflow depending on how busy your VC is. And what happens is that it becomes negative. These values become negative. And negative values are never being returned, or events with a negative ID are never being returned over this API that we are using. And that's why we didn't see them versus GoVC and PowerCLI get VI event, there's a different API and they could read different events coming from that. But anyways, it's a bug, and we're currently working with engineering on like short and long-term fix. Short term is you need to do some database manipulation, but obviously this requires downtime and might also be disrupted to the events that you kind of, which are there but have a negative ID. So it certainly means you could like at least lose events, or events are not being fired and triggered correctly at some point in time. And there is a KB for this, like a related KB, which is triggered by a host process, or I think it's an agent, a sensor, which just sends too many events into vCenter, and then it's like the database grows in size, but then also this kind of overflow happens quickly because the sensor is just sending too many events into VC. But so far, like VEBA is kind of a very prominent example of using this events API. This hasn't been really discovered widely in the field outside of the sensor bug. And now VEBA is exposing this bug again. And so we are working with the engineering team. So if you face this issue, whether you're using VEBA or any of the other APIs, and you're wondering why you're not receiving any of the events, that might actually could be caused by this bug. Any questions on this one? Cool.
Maybe it's worth put it. Is there a section for like known issues? Because maybe so like people that are new to VEBA and doesn't, you know, like they're not on this call will come and face it. Maybe it's worth like tracking somewhere. So it's like easy.
Yeah, that's a good point, Avery. We do the virtual appliance, which is where most folks go and grab the appliance. You know, we do have the ability to kind of put some notes there. So in the past, if there was like a known,
in the Fling, right, on the bugs or something.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think because we're just still, you know, investigating and trying to understand it. So I think once we get to kind of complete root cause, Avery.
Then you put it there. It makes sense.
Yeah. Yep. We'll put a note right at the download URL, and then you know, we'll make a note of that for anybody that's interested. Thanks for that call.
No problem.
All right. Cool. And so I have a demo prepared, just in the good spirit of having demos in these meetings, but exactly. But before we go to the demo, any questions, feedback, whatever you want to discuss, so open forum. And if not, obviously we will do the demo. Okay, sounds good. So let me briefly talk about this small thing that I built recently. It's a prototype similar to the preemption prototype that I showed in the November meeting, I guess. And the idea of this prototype was that if you wanted to use or have direct access to vCenter events for some computations, for example, like say you want to count the number of login events, or you want to do some aggregations or some analytics or some other fancy stuff on these events. This is currently not really possible with VEBA because right now every function only gets invoked with one event and is supposed to be stateless, meaning you get a VM powered on event, the function does something and that's done. If you want to do more fancy stuff like streaming, analytics, and all the stuff, VEBA currently is not the right model because it has this single function invocation per event kind of type. Sometimes you do want to do more like stuff on multiple events, on events chains, for example. And then the next question is like, how, if you can't use VEBA, you would basically have to use any of the APIs that we have and the SDKs. And you know, it's for most people, it's not easy to use the SOAP APIs because it involves a little bit of like boilerplate code. And that's also like the benefit of using VEBA, right? Because it shields and hides all these complexities of the underlying vSphere API to deal with events. Now I thought, well, what if we could build like a REST API or a small service, Kubernetes deployment, if you want, that exposes these events, the vCenter events, with a nice REST API. So that if you do want to do this like stateful stuff, you can either use the prototype as an example and play with it, or you can enhance it, change it, whatever, like code is open source. And so the idea was to use a REST API I mean, there's different types of streaming APIs that I could use, but I felt like REST is easy because you can use curl or Postman or whatever, and then connect to this little deployment. I called it the vSphere event streaming service or application. And then it has a couple of APIs. One is the range call. It will basically tell you the event IDs that it currently has in the database, if you want. And so again, these event IDs are unique per event. For example, this is an example event here from vCenter. The ID is 44, and they go up. And then obviously we have this int32 bug, right, where they wrap and become negatives. And then the other one is once you have this, the range, which is growing, by the way, like it starts at whatever the first event is that service reads from vCenter. Then you can do queries on this range. You can query for a particular event by ID. Here in this case, 44. But you can also stream or say like watch the events starting from a particular point in time. If you don't specify any parameter, you just say, hey, watch the events. It will give you all the events that come through on that service since booting the service. You can also start the watch stream at a particular offset or event ID if you want, and then it will give you all the events in the system. So let me show you how that works in practice and how to deploy the service. So in the release here, on the release page, there's a YAML file, which you need to download. That's all explained in detail here in the deployment section. The only thing that you need is a Kubernetes environment. And you can even use the VEBA appliance for that because it has Kubernetes. And then in that deployment manifest, I hope it's readable, the size. Or is it too small?
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
Okay, cool. So in the deployment manifest, there's like a lot of stuff, the container, blah, blah, blah.
I think you're not showing the YAML. If you try to open it, it's like in the other tab.
You are right. So here is the release YAML file that you would download right from this page. And it has a bit of stuff in here, but what is important for you is to just configure it with your vCenter environment, where it should connect to and read the events from vCenter. And I'm using, in my example, I'm using the vCenter simulator, which is an application that we provide, which kind of mimics some important vCenter APIs. And you can basically deploy it easily if you don't have a proper vCenter or you don't want to use a full vCenter. And so I have already deployed the vCSim in my environment. And then I have configured where it basically lives. And then you need to, or you can set some configuration values for how the event stream service behaves. And so first you can define the time, like the begin of the event, like how much time it should look back when booting. So when the service comes up, by default, it will retrieve the last 5 minutes of event and then obviously keep tailing or following the events. You can also say, like, I always want to start 1 hour ago, or 10 minutes or whatever, or you can even set it to 0 minutes and basically say now. And that helps because the service itself is stateless, because the events are in the database in vCenter, so there's no need to also like persist them locally in the service. And it helps, like, if the service crashes or reboots or whatever, it will basically have a recovery time objective of, in this case, 5 minutes. So it will retrieve the last 5 minutes. If the service was down for 1 hour, you would have to tune this value to be like 1 hour to not miss events. And then you can configure some buffer sizes of how many events do you want to keep in memory, because the more events you keep in memory, obviously the more size the container will use during runtime. But it's easy, like you can even set it to 1,000, 10,000. That's because the size of the event is very small, and so that's not going to really increase the footprint there. And that's it. Then you can quickly deploy it. So let me deploy it here on my command line. I hope it's readable. So we create the release, and then here on the right, let me just close this stuff. On the right, you see this, the application has started. It's here. And I can show you quickly the logs. And it basically says, yeah, I'm starting my HTTP server. I'm starting the stream, the collector begin like 5 minutes ago. And then it's writing events. And the first event it got was like with the ID 33. It was like 5 minutes ago, apparently, right? Like still within that window. Okay, so that's nice. And now let's do some curl stuff. Because I'm running this locally, the curl commands locally on my machine, I need to do a port forwarding to access Kubernetes API. Let me quickly do this. So I'm setting up here a port forwarding on my local machine so I can reach out, like curl this Kubernetes deployment here. So this is running. And now here I can do a curl, and let's start with the range curl. The range curl currently says that the earliest event that it had is with the ID 33 and the latest is 33. So basically that's just one event currently in there. And if I would have changed like this value of 5 minutes to say 1 hour, let me do that actually. Let me delete it again and create it again. So just do the port forwarding again. All right. Then we should see more events in the range, at least 2. Okay. So I can also use GoVC on my machine to interact with this vCenter simulator that the stream is connected to. And that's basically how I start generating events to like trigger that guy. So let me power off a virtual machine. This guy. That should give us a little bit more events. See, earliest is 33, obviously, and the latest is 36. Now let's look at what these events are. Let's go events and say, I want this guy. And let's properly format it with JQ. And so here's our event. And it's a cloud event, as you also see from VEBA. It has a source, it has a type, and it has the data, which is then the actual vCenter event that comes out of this. And this is a VM powered off event, right? The VM is powered off. So that's nice. But because we know that we can actually, that the earliest timestamp or event is 33, what I can do is I can say, I want to watch this guy and I want to start offset at 33. That's the earliest one that we have. And so what happens is, I'll just move this away here. What happens is that JQ will give us all the data. Let me just filter by ID of these events. So we can basically time travel back into the event stream just by like plain curl query. And this is like, if you want to do it programmatically with the vCenter APIs, there's a lot of like code involved to do this. And so if you are interested in, okay, so what's the type of the events that happened? It's a session event, stopping event, powered off event. So if I don't stop this command here, the curl command, and I turn off the VM, I turn it on again, you will actually see that we keep following the log. So it's powered on, and you see it's a started event and a powered off, powered on event. If I stop it and then range again, I will see there's more events in here. And then I can do like a query for event. What is the last one? 38. And that's the VM that was powered on. And so this is nice because it like simplifies the way you can read events from VC. You don't have to use the UI or the collector or any of the other stuff. It's literally just the HTTP REST API. And it allows for these kind of streaming semantics without causing any of like storage, because it just kept all in memory and retrieved from vCenter during the boot up of this machine.
You know, this is
any questions?
This is actually interesting because I think Avery had mentioned around, you know, Sockeye, right, which is a great visual UI utility. There are some constraints.
Yeah, this is really cool. I was
I was going to say that this might be interesting for you. And you get to see the payload. You can kind of traverse back, and there's a number of ways of filtering it, right? Including this kind of follow mechanism.
I was just thinking, like, it would be really cool if you can filter based on also event type. So if you don't want to see all the events, you want to see like.
Yep. So so basically the type is what the type is what you're interested in, right? So what I have not, because of the REST API, it's easy to add filtering capabilities to this guy, right? So say like and filter equals blah blah blah. But
yeah,
right
like
now,
and type equals and then the name of the type or something.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. The reason I did not do this right now is because it's so simple to read the data that you can do all this filtering mechanics locally with your machine because it's JSON output, right? It's really a JSON stream. So if you have Postman, you can just read the data in and then do like local filtering and all this stuff. Because, you know, when you add filtering capabilities to an HTTP API, you have to understand the semantics, and then someone wants to filter inside the data field. So it gets complex a lot. So I didn't add it initially to the API, just to like get feedback. And if that's useful, I can add it. But also if you have JQ, which is like this JSON query, right? A parser, that's easy to do locally and play with it and then figure out like what is an interested event, like JQ here. And JQ also allows you to do transformations, right? To basically uppercase all the stuff or trim it or concatenate stuff. JQ is really powerful in doing all the stuff that you were just asked for, Aubrey.
Yeah, I used JQ in the past. It's like you have to really learn how to use it to do a lot of the complex manipulations. But yeah.
Yes, yeah. For filtering, obviously, like filtering, I guess it would be. Let me just quickly try one. JQ, and then this one. And just try select, and then here dot type equals. I think this is probably the equal, and then use this guy. See if this quickly worked. Yeah, worked. Okay, and then give me the ID of all the events that were powered on. Well, that's not correct. Maybe this one. Yeah, okay, this worked. So let's select all the events with the type powered on event and give me the ID. So that's 38. But I agree, the syntax of JQ is like improvable, to say the least. But if this is useful, open an issue and
yeah,
just
this tool is exactly what I was looking for. Like it's a perfect replacement for me for like sockeye.
Oh, cool. Yes. And so again, the only thing that you need to play with then is these parameters.
Is the parameters,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. In a very busy VC, you can easily basically overflow like 10,000 events in that memory. And so just play with the values, right? Because the more memory it uses, obviously it might early hit the CPU and memory limits, and then the pod will crash because Kubernetes is going to kill the pod with an out of memory exception. But again, like all configurable, just give it enough memory and you can keep all the stuff in memory if you wanted to.
I'll play with it and I'll let you guys know.
That would be nice, yeah. And we always like try to give that feedback also to the engineering teams. Like they're also eager to learn how they can simplify or modernize some of these APIs. And so that's why I also built this like to learn and see if the syntax works, like the watch and the offset based approach. And if it makes sense, then maybe it will kind of be incorporated in any of the APIs as well. Cool, that's all I had for the demo. Any other questions, comments? Sharing here. Avery, did you get the link of the project page?
Yeah. I captured it while you were talking.
Okay.
And I also found out that there's this like K9S thing that I didn't know existed, but it looks really cool.
yeah, that's great. That's right. Perfect. So if that's all, then thanks everyone for joining. That was a good call, and see you next time. Thanks, Jeff, for the feedback as well. Absolutely. See you in February then.
Take care, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye.